Everyone avoided the Blind Mafia Boss until his new assistant treated him like an ordinary man. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a quick favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our channel's latest videos. It only takes a moment. It is completely free, and it is one of the best ways to support us as we continue bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means so much to us. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let us return to our main character and continue the story. People do not stop seeing you because you become weak. They stop seeing you because they become afraid of what your weakness reminds them about themselves. 3 years ago, darkness became the only world I knew. The doctors explained the medical terms with careful voices, but I barely heard them. All I truly understood was that the man who had once walked into every room with complete confidence would never see another sunrise, another face, or another reflection in the mirror. At first, everyone promised nothing would change. My closest advisors insisted they would remain loyal. Business partners assured me they still believed in my judgment. Even members of my own family spoke with comforting words. But promises are easy to make while hope is still alive. Reality arrives quietly. It begins with longer pauses before people answer your questions. Meetings become shorter. Conversations become carefully edited. Chairs scrape across polished floors as people exchange nervous glances that I cannot see but can easily hear. Their silence tells the truth long before their words ever do. They no longer speak to Sebastian Calloway. They speak to the Blind Mafia Boss. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a man and became a condition that made everyone uncomfortable. Every morning followed the same routine. Thomas announced my schedule. Eleanor informed me about the household. Dr. Matthew Collins reminded me not to overwork. Richard Foster summarized legal matters with exhausting precision. They were all professional. They were all respectful. Yet every sentence carried the invisible weight of pity. I hated pity more than I had ever hated failure. Pity quietly steals the last piece of dignity a person is trying to protect. My office overlooked the city skyline, or at least it had before darkness claimed my eyesight. Now I measured time through different details. The warmth of sunlight reaching my face through the windows. The faint vibration of traffic below. The rich scent of freshly brewed coffee placed exactly 6 inches from my right hand every morning. The soft ticking of the antique clock my mother had loved. I had learned that losing sight forces you to notice everything else. Even so, the world had become painfully lonely. Assistants rarely lasted more than a few weeks. Some spoke so softly they seemed afraid of disturbing me. Others rushed to help before I even moved a hand, treating me like fragile glass instead of a capable adult. A few avoided speaking altogether unless absolutely necessary. None of them stayed long enough to know who I truly was beneath the reputation everyone feared. One rainy Monday morning, Thomas knocked gently before opening the office door. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "your new assistant has arrived." I nodded without much interest. Another replacement. Another uncomfortable conversation. Another person who would apologize every time I reached for something without assistance. I heard unfamiliar footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. Calm, unhurried, confident. She stopped a respectful distance from my desk before speaking. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. My name is Grace Monroe. Your first meeting begins in 20 minutes, and I organized today's files in the same order listed on your schedule." She did not apologize for my blindness. She did not lower her voice with sympathy. She did not ask whether I was comfortable. She simply treated me like every other employer she had ever worked for. For several seconds, I forgot to answer because no one had spoken to me that way in years. Then I found myself asking the first question that had genuinely interested me since losing my sight. "Ms. Monroe," I said quietly, "why are you not afraid of me?" She answered without hesitation. "Because I came here to work with a man, not a rumor." At that moment, without seeing her face, I realized someone had just walked into my life who refused to let darkness decide who I was. Trust is never built through grand promises. It begins with the quiet moments when someone chooses honesty over comfort. Grace Monroe had been my assistant for less than a week, yet the atmosphere inside my office already felt different. She never hovered beside me waiting to rescue me from ordinary tasks. She never rushed across the room simply because I reached for a folder or stood from my chair. Instead, she described the world around me with calm precision, allowing me to decide what I wanted to do. The first time she guided me into the conference room, she did not take my arm without asking. She simply said, "There are 12 steps ahead. The doorway is slightly to your left. The chair at the head of the table is already pulled out." It was such a simple difference, yet it restored something I thought I had lost forever. It restored my choice. During our morning meetings, she quietly painted pictures with words. "Mr. Calloway, the windows are open today. It is raining lightly outside. The clouds are low over the city, and everyone arrived carrying wet umbrellas." Suddenly, I no longer felt trapped inside darkness. I could almost hear the gray sky through her voice. One afternoon, we attended a financial strategy meeting with several senior executives. I listened carefully as department directors presented quarterly reports. Numbers rarely lied, but people often did. One executive spoke confidently about reduced operating expenses and improved efficiency. His voice remained steady, yet something about the rhythm of his breathing seemed forced. Before I could respond, Grace quietly placed a document beside my hand and whispered just loudly enough for me to hear. "He keeps looking toward the chief financial officer every time you ask a question. He has avoided eye contact since the meeting began. His hands are shaking." I remained silent for several seconds. Then I calmly asked the executive to explain one specific expense report again. This time his answer changed. The room became noticeably quieter. I heard someone shift uneasily in a leather chair. Papers rustled across the polished table. Finally, another executive admitted there had been accounting mistakes that required immediate correction. Mistakes. That was the word they chose. After the meeting ended, I stood beside the elevator while everyone quietly dispersed. "How did you notice that?" I asked Grace as we waited alone. She answered with complete simplicity. "People reveal themselves long before they realize they are speaking. Most just forget to listen with more than their ears." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. For years I believed blindness had taken something essential away from me. Yet Grace never behaved as though I had less to offer. Instead, she showed me that I still possessed every ability that truly mattered. I only needed someone willing to describe the pieces I could no longer see. Over the following days, our routine became effortless. She learned exactly how I organized contracts, where I preferred my coffee placed on the desk, and how many seconds I needed to memorize the layout of unfamiliar rooms. In return, I trusted her judgment more than I trusted anyone else in the building. That realization surprised me more than losing my sight ever had. Trust had once been the rarest currency in my world, and somehow a woman who treated me like an ordinary man had earned it without ever asking for it. As we left the office one quiet evening, I found myself wondering what kind of life had taught Grace Monroe to understand people with such remarkable clarity. And for the first time in years, I wanted to know someone else's story more than I wanted to protect my own. Some people earn your trust by proving they are capable. Others earn it because they quietly remind you that goodness still exists. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Grace Monroe first walked into my office, and for reasons I could not fully explain, the silence that once surrounded my days no longer felt empty. Her footsteps had become as familiar to me as the steady ticking of the antique clock resting against the far wall. Every morning she entered exactly 2 minutes before my first appointment, placed a fresh cup of coffee in its usual place, and reviewed the day's schedule with calm confidence that never sounded rehearsed. She never wasted words, yet somehow every conversation felt meaningful. The more I listened to her, the more one question refused to leave my mind. How had someone so young learned to understand another person's limitations without making them feel diminished? Curiosity eventually overcame caution. One afternoon, after Grace left to organize several contracts for the following week, I asked Richard Foster to step into my office. He closed the door behind him before speaking. "What can I do for you, Mr. Calloway?" I remained quiet for a moment before answering. "I want you to look into Grace Monroe's background." Richard hesitated, clearly surprised by the request. "Do you suspect something?" I slowly shook my head. "No, that is exactly what concerns me. I do not suspect anything." He understood immediately. In my world, trust rarely arrived without hidden motives. Grace seemed to be the first exception I had encountered in years. 2 days later, Richard returned carrying a neatly organized file. I heard the soft sound of papers being placed on my desk before he began reading. Grace Monroe has no criminal record. Excellent academic history. Former administrative coordinator at a regional healthcare organization. Strong references from every previous employer. Everything sounded ordinary until Richard paused. There is one detail that explains much of what you have experienced. I leaned forward slightly. Go on. For almost 8 years, Grace cared for her father after he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. During the final years of his illness, he gradually lost his independence. She managed his appointments, helped him navigate familiar places, and learned how to communicate without making him feel helpless. I closed my eyes even though darkness already surrounded me. Suddenly, every conversation we had shared made perfect sense. She had never treated me with pity because she had already learned that compassion and pity were not the same thing. Richard continued. Neighbors described her as patient beyond measure. Several nurses mentioned she always encouraged her father to make his own decisions whenever possible. I quietly smiled to myself. That was exactly how she treated me every single day. She never completed my journey for me. She simply removed the obstacles that prevented me from walking it myself. Later that afternoon, I stepped into the hallway outside my office just as Grace finished speaking on the telephone with one of our clients. She did not realize I was standing nearby. One of the receptionists smiled and asked her a question that drifted clearly through the quiet corridor. How do you always know exactly what Mr. Calloway needs? Grace answered gently, without hesitation. Because I stopped focusing on what he cannot see. I pay attention to everything he still can. Those simple words reached me more deeply than she could have imagined. For the first time since losing my sight, I realized someone had looked beyond my blindness without pretending it did not exist. As I quietly returned to my office, another question settled heavily inside my thoughts. If Grace had carried so much responsibility for someone she loved, I could only wonder what kind of loss had shaped the remarkable strength she carried so gracefully every single day. The truth rarely announces itself with loud voices. More often, it waits patiently until someone finally chooses to stop running from it. A month had passed since Grace Monroe became my assistant, and the quiet rhythm she brought into my life had become something I depended on more than I cared to admit. She anticipated problems before they reached my office, protected my independence without drawing attention to it, and somehow managed to make every room feel less empty simply by being present. For the first time since losing my sight, I no longer dreaded walking into another day. Then everything changed on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Richard Foster requested a private meeting immediately after lunch. His voice carried a seriousness that I had learned never to ignore. The moment he closed my office door, I knew whatever he had discovered was not routine. He placed several folders onto my desk before speaking carefully. Mr. Calloway, I reopened the investigation surrounding the accident that caused your blindness. My hands instinctively tightened around the armrests of my chair. 3 years had passed since that day. Every official report had called it an unavoidable accident. Every investigator had reached the same conclusion. I had forced myself to accept it because there seemed to be no other choice. What did you find? I asked quietly. Richard took a slow breath. Financial records, internal correspondence, and several witness statements do not match the original investigation. The room became completely silent except for the steady ticking of my mother's old clock. Someone manipulated important evidence before the final report was completed. His next sentence seemed to stop time itself. There is reason to believe the incident was not an accident at all. I remained perfectly still. I had prepared myself for many possibilities during the past 3 years, but never for those words. Betrayal always hurts more when it arrives wearing the face of certainty. Richard continued carefully. There are indications that someone close to the organization benefited financially after your injuries prevented you from leading daily operations. I slowly lowered my head. I did not ask for names because deep inside I already feared where the investigation might lead. The thought that someone I had trusted could have welcomed my suffering was more painful than the darkness surrounding my eyes. Richard quietly left the office to allow me time alone. Hours later, I remained sitting in complete silence until I heard Grace gently knock before entering. She immediately sensed something had changed. "Mr. Calloway," she asked softly, "are you all right?" I laughed once without humor. I am beginning to wonder whether I have ever known the people around me. She did not answer immediately. Instead, She quietly pulled a chair beside my desk and sat down. Her silence never felt uncomfortable. It felt respectful. After several long moments, I finally told her the truth. I explained everything Richard had uncovered without mentioning names or accusations. When I finished speaking, I expected anger, outrage, or encouragement to seek revenge. Instead, Grace said something I never expected to hear. Do not let hatred become your eyesight. The sentence settled into the silence between us. If anger becomes the only thing guiding your decisions, she continued gently, then the people who hurt you will still be controlling your life. I slowly exhaled, feeling the weight of those words. For years I believed losing my vision had been the greatest tragedy of my life. Now I understood an even greater danger stood before me. It was not blindness. It was allowing bitterness to become the only way I could see the world. As Grace quietly gathered the unopened files from my desk, I realized the investigation had uncovered more than hidden evidence. It had opened a door to a truth that would force me to question every relationship I had ever trusted, including one I never imagined could betray me. Healing does not begin the day you forget your pain. It begins the day you decide your pain will no longer decide who you become. The morning after my conversation with Grace Monroe, I canceled every unnecessary meeting on my calendar and asked Thomas to prepare the car. He sounded surprised because I almost never changed my schedule without weeks of planning, but he quietly agreed. Grace met me in the front hallway exactly on time. Where are we going? I asked as she helped me settle into the back seat. Her voice carried the smallest hint of amusement. Somewhere that does not care about your title. Nearly 40 minutes later, the car stopped. I stepped onto a sidewalk filled with the sounds of children laughing, basketballs bouncing across pavement, and wind moving through tall maple trees. The air smelled of fresh grass and bread from a nearby bakery. Grace gently described the surroundings. We are at a neighborhood community center. The after-school program begins in a few minutes. I followed her inside, listening as dozens of young voices filled the building with energy that no boardroom had ever possessed. No one whispered when I entered. No one lowered their voice because of my blindness. A little boy accidentally bumped into my arm before quickly apologizing. Grace laughed softly. Mr. Calloway, this is Ethan Walker. He is 9 years old and believes every adult should know how to play chess. Ethan immediately asked, "Do you play?" I smiled before answering. Not as well as I used to. The boy thought for only a second before replying. That is okay. We can both practice. His honesty made everyone nearby laugh, including me. We spent the next hour together while Grace quietly described each move across the chessboard. Ethan announced every capture with dramatic excitement, and when he finally won the game, he celebrated as though he had just earned a championship trophy. I congratulated him sincerely because I realized something unexpected. He had never once treated me differently from anyone else. To him, I was simply another opponent sitting across the table. Later that afternoon, Grace led me a few blocks to Pastor Jonathan Reed's church, where volunteers prepared food boxes for local families. Instead of asking me to stand aside while others worked, Grace placed folded cardboard boxes in front of me and calmly explained where each item belonged. Before long, my hands moved confidently through the familiar rhythm of packing canned vegetables, rice, pasta, and fresh fruit. I could hear conversations surrounding me, people thanking one another, children helping their parents, and volunteers encouraging neighbors they had known for years. The room felt warmer than any formal banquet I had attended. As we finished loading the final boxes, I turned toward Grace. "Why did you bring me here?" She answered with quiet certainty. "Because the world is much bigger than the rooms where people compete for power." We walked outside as the evening sun warmed the sidewalks after a cool spring afternoon. Birds filled the trees with cheerful songs, and somewhere nearby a lawn mower hummed steadily across fresh grass. I stood still for a long moment, allowing every sound to settle into my memory. "Grace," I said quietly, "I have not felt this peaceful in years." She answered with the same calm honesty that had changed my life from the beginning. "You still see more goodness than most people with perfect eyesight. You only forgot where to look." Her words remained with me during the entire drive home, and for the first time since darkness entered my life, I found myself wondering whether losing my vision had never truly prevented me from seeing what mattered most. The quietest voices often leave the deepest echoes because they speak directly to the places that have been hurting the longest. The days following our visit to the community center seemed to move more slowly, as though life itself wanted me to notice details I had ignored for years. Every morning, the warmth of the sun reached my office before the conversations began. Every afternoon, the familiar scent of coffee mixed with fresh paper and polished wood. None of those things had changed. I had. One evening, after the last meeting ended, Grace Monroe quietly asked whether I wanted to spend a few more minutes in the estate garden before going inside. I agreed without asking why. The spring air felt cool against my face as we followed the stone pathway toward a wooden bench overlooking the fountain my mother had loved. The water moved with the same gentle rhythm I remembered from childhood. I had not visited this corner of the estate in years. "Your mother used to come here often, did she not?" Grace asked. I nodded slowly. She believed this was the only place where people stopped pretending. We sat together in comfortable silence while birds settled into the nearby trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then a memory returned with surprising clarity. I could almost hear my mother's voice carried gently by the evening breeze. "Sebastian," she used to say whenever I became impatient as a young man, "the eyes only guide your steps. Your heart chooses the direction." I smiled faintly as the words found me again after so many years. "She believed strength had nothing to do with control," I said quietly. "She always reminded me that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you accomplished." My voice grew softer. I thought I understood her while she was alive. I only realized now how little I listened. Grace remained silent, allowing the memory to breathe instead of interrupting it. That simple kindness broke something inside me that I had held together for far too long. Without warning, tears slowly found their way down my face. I had not cried the day I lost my sight. I had not cried during endless surgeries or lonely nights or painful disappointments. Yet sitting beside someone who expected nothing from me, I finally allowed myself to grieve everything I had buried beneath pride. Grace never reached to stop my tears. She never told me to be strong. She simply remained beside me, reminding me that presence can sometimes comfort more deeply than words. After several quiet moments, I finally spoke again. "If Richard proves the truth about what happened 3 years ago, I will have a choice." I drew a slow breath before continuing. "I can spend the rest of my life chasing revenge, or I can build something that prevents other people from living through the same loneliness." Grace gently turned toward me. "Only one of those choices will make your mother proud." Her answer carried no judgment, only quiet certainty. I lowered my head and allowed the cool evening air to settle around us. "Then I know which path I must choose," I replied. "If justice comes, I will not use it to prove my power. I will use it to protect people who have no one else standing beside them." The fountain continued its peaceful song while the last warmth of daylight faded across the garden. As we slowly walked back toward the house, I realized my blindness had never taken away my future. It had only forced me to discover a purpose greater than the life I had once believed was worth protecting, and somewhere ahead waited a truth that would test whether I truly meant every promise I had just made. The measure of a person's character is revealed not by what they build for themselves, but by what they leave behind for people they may never even meet. The investigation reached its conclusion early one Monday morning. Richard Foster entered my office carrying a single folder instead of the towering stacks of documents that had filled our meetings for weeks. He placed it gently on my desk before speaking with calm certainty. "Mr. Calloway, every financial record has been verified. Every witness statement has been confirmed. The people responsible for manipulating the original investigation have been identified, and the evidence has been turned over to the proper legal authorities." I remained silent for several moments. 3 years of unanswered questions had finally received their answers, yet I felt no satisfaction. There was only an unexpected sense of peace. Hatred had quietly lost its place inside me long before justice arrived. I thought about my mother's voice beside the fountain. I thought about Grace Monroe sitting beside me without trying to erase my pain. I realized they had already given me something far greater than revenge. They had given me a future. That afternoon, I gathered my senior leadership team in the main conference room. Grace sat beside me, prepared to review the agenda, while Richard, Thomas, Eleanor Brooks, and Dr. Matthew Collins waited quietly for the meeting to begin. "Today," I said, "we are closing one chapter of my life, and we are opening another. I announced that every remaining investment connected to the organization that had once built my reputation would be permanently dissolved through lawful restructuring and redirected toward legitimate businesses and charitable initiatives. Some people in the room seemed surprised. Others sounded relieved. None of them argued. For the first time in many years, my decisions were no longer driven by fear or pride. They were guided by purpose. Within 2 months, the Callaway Foundation officially opened under the leadership of Olivia Bennett, whose years of nonprofit experience immediately transformed ideas into meaningful action. The foundation partnered with schools, churches, and community organizations to provide educational scholarships, career training, counseling services, and assistance for families facing unexpected hardship. Pastor Jonathan Reed welcomed the partnership with quiet gratitude, reminding everyone that hope often begins with one person deciding another life is worth protecting. A few weeks later, Grace invited me back to the same community center where I had first met Ethan Walker. The sound of children laughing greeted us before we even reached the entrance. Ethan hurried across the room so quickly that I heard his sneakers sliding against the polished floor. "Mr. Callaway," he shouted excitedly, "I have something to tell you." He carefully placed an envelope into my hands. Grace smiled as she described the bold blue letters printed across the front. "It is an acceptance letter," she said softly. Ethan could barely contain his excitement. "I got the scholarship. I can go to the science camp this summer." His joy filled the room more brightly than any applause ever could. I congratulated him, and without thinking he wrapped his arms around me in a grateful embrace. In that simple moment, I understood that real success is measured by opportunities created for others rather than achievements collected for yourself. As we left the community center together, Grace quietly asked whether I regretted the path I had chosen. I smiled and shook my head. "Not for a single moment," I answered. "I spent years trying to protect my position. Now I would rather spend the rest of my life protecting people's possibilities." As we walked toward the waiting car beneath the warm afternoon sun, I realized that the greatest legacy is never the power you possess. It is the hope you leave behind for someone who still believes tomorrow can become something better than today. Respect feels completely different from admiration because admiration often fades when circumstances change, but respect grows stronger every time character is tested. Nearly 1 year passed after the Callaway Foundation first opened its doors, and every season seemed to leave behind another reminder that a single compassionate decision could reach farther than anyone expected. The foundation expanded its scholarship program into neighboring communities. The counseling center welcomed hundreds of families searching for hope, and Pastor Jonathan Reed often joked that he had never seen so many volunteers arriving before sunrise with smiles instead of complaints. Olivia Bennett guided every project with remarkable wisdom, making certain every donation became an opportunity rather than a temporary solution. Grace Monroe remained beside me every working day, yet our relationship had quietly changed in ways neither of us ever discussed. She no longer anticipated every step because I no longer needed her to. Instead, she simply walked beside me whenever our paths happened to be the same. That difference meant more to me than words could ever express. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the city hosted its annual community leadership celebration, recognizing organizations that had strengthened neighborhoods through education, volunteer service, and family support. Olivia insisted the foundation should accept the invitation. I resisted at first because public recognition had never interested me, but Grace gently reminded me that accepting gratitude on behalf of every volunteer was not the same as seeking attention for myself. When we arrived, I immediately noticed the familiar sounds of children laughing, local musicians tuning their instruments, and families filling the park with cheerful conversations. Grace quietly described colorful banners stretching across the main stage, while autumn leaves drifted through the cool afternoon breeze. She told me Ethan Walker was sitting in the front row wearing the biggest smile she had ever seen. Before the ceremony began, dozens of people approached simply to shake my hand. A retired teacher thanked the foundation for helping her students receive new books. A young father explained that career training had allowed him to find stable work after losing his previous job. An elderly widow quietly whispered that weekly counseling sessions had helped her rediscover hope after years of loneliness. None of them mentioned my past. None of them cared about the title I once carried. They only spoke about lives moving forward. When my name was announced, Grace softly guided me toward the podium before stepping back into the audience. For a brief moment, I stood alone, listening to the gentle wind moving through the trees and the quiet anticipation filling the park. I had once believed losing my eyesight meant I would never again stand before a crowd with confidence. Now I realized confidence had never come from seeing faces. It came from knowing why I was standing there. I thanked every volunteer, every teacher, every counselor, every parent, and every child who had trusted the foundation with their dreams. I spoke about dignity instead of success, compassion instead of influence, and service instead of recognition. When I finished, silence filled the park for one heartbeat before hundreds of people rose to their feet together. Their applause echoed across the open field, but what touched me most was what Grace quietly whispered after returning to my side. Not one person stood because they felt sorry for you. I smiled as emotion settled gently inside my heart. No, I answered. Today they stood because they believed in what all of us built together. As we slowly walked away from the stage beneath the golden afternoon sky, I realized there was one miracle greater than recovering lost sight. It was discovering that when people finally stop seeing your limitations, they begin seeing the purpose that was waiting inside you all along. The greatest miracle in my life was never the day I learned to live without my eyesight. It was the day I realized I no longer needed it to recognize what truly mattered. A few weeks after the community leadership celebration, Grace Monroe suggested we take one final walk through the old east wing of the Callaway estate before renovations began. The hallway had remained untouched for years because it held too many memories that I had never found the courage to revisit. The polished hardwood floors still echoed beneath our footsteps exactly as they had when I was a young man. The faint scent of cedar lingered in the walls, and somewhere nearby the antique grandfather clock continued marking each passing second with quiet patience. Grace described the afternoon sunlight spilling through the tall windows, warming the marble floor just as my mother used to remember. We eventually stopped outside the private study where I had spent countless nights after losing my sight. I remembered sitting alone inside that room, convinced that darkness had taken everything worth living for. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt familiar, but no longer lonely. Grace finally asked the simplest question anyone had ever placed before me. "What do you see?" A younger version of myself would have answered with bitterness. He would have spoken about endless darkness, broken dreams, and opportunities forever lost. Instead, I smiled. I see Thomas greeting every employee by name each morning. I see Eleanor leading the household with kindness instead of fear. I see Richard choosing truth over convenience. I see Dr. Matthew Collins reminding people that healing takes patience. I see Pastor Jonathan Reed filling empty hearts with hope. I see Olivia Bennett building opportunities for families she may never personally meet. I see Ethan Walker chasing a future that once felt impossible. Most of all, I said quietly, I see the woman who walked into my office and refused to believe my blindness was the most important thing about me. Grace did not answer immediately. I could hear her gentle breathing beside me and the distant sound of birds outside the open window. Finally, she spoke in the same calm voice that had changed my life from the very beginning. "You always had the ability to see those things, Sebastian. You only needed someone to remind you to trust your own heart." Her words settled gently into the quiet afternoon. I thought back to the frightened man I had become after the accident, measuring every relationship through suspicion and every conversation through loss. I remembered believing people only saw a blind mafia boss whenever they looked at me. The truth had been far more complicated. Many people had stopped seeing me because I had stopped seeing myself. Grace never returned my eyesight because that was never the miracle she offered. She returned my confidence, my purpose, and my willingness to believe that compassion could become stronger than fear. As we slowly walked toward the front entrance of the estate, warm sunlight touched my face while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers across the gardens. I could not see the colors Grace quietly described, yet somehow I felt as though the world had never been more beautiful. Before opening the front door, I turned toward the sound of her footsteps one last time. "Grace," I said softly, "I lost my sight years ago, but you helped me find my vision." She gently took my hand for a brief moment before letting go. "Sometimes," she replied, "the clearest vision has never belonged to our eyes. It has always belonged to the choices we make after life changes us. And as we stepped forward together into everything that still waited beyond that doorway, I understood the lesson I would carry for the rest of my life. A person is never truly defined by what they lose. They are defined by what they choose to become after the loss has passed.